Hi, guys. Welcome back to History for Sleep. What if everything you thought you knew about life at sea, brotherhood, discipline, loyalty, left out the most human part of all desire? During the age of sail, thousands of men lived for months aboard wooden ships far from land and law. They worked, fought, and slept inches apart. Some formed bonds that went deeper than duty, whispered about by captains, hinted at in court records, and sometimes punished by death. Others turned those relationships into quiet partnerships that kept crews united through storms and battles. Was it love survival, or something the Navy refused to name? The truth was never written openly, but it lingers between the lines of sailors' journals and trial logs. Let me know what time you've come aboard sunrise or midnight tide. And if you like history that sails into what others avoid, subscribe. No pressure, but the next journey dives even deeper. The smell hits you first. Tar salt and unwashed humanity. It's not exactly perfume, but it's the signature scent of every sailing ship that ever left Europe chasing fortune. You grip the railing, looking down at a deck packed with men. Too many men, really. 200 souls. One woman's face painted on the prow, and not a single proper secret left on board. Here privacy is as rare as fresh fruit, and rumors move faster than the wind. Some are harmless, who cheated at dice, who's been drinking the captain's rum, but others carry the weight of danger whispers about who's getting a little too close when the hammocks sway at night. Life on a ship during the 17th and 18th centuries isn't just brutal. It's intimate in ways no one on land would ever understand. You eat together, fight together, and sleep practically stacked like sardines. A few months at sea, and personal boundaries become folklore. There's a reason sailors joked that they could tell who shared a hammock by how synchronized their snoring was. Officially, sodomy was a crime punishable by death in the Royal Navy. Unofficially, loneliness doesn't read the rule book. You might have heard of the lash, the Navy's favorite form of punishment. But what they never told you is that the real weapon was silence. If you were caught, you didn't just face the whip. You faced exile in a world that already floated miles from civilization. Picture this. It's 1704, the HMS Resolution slicing through the Atlantic. The crew hasn't seen land in 6 weeks. The decks are crusted with salt and sweat. The biscuits have more weevils than flour, and the only thing that still feels human is conversation. Among the sailors, 2 young men share jokes. A bit too private, laughs a bit too long. They pass a small carved trinket between them, pretending it's just a charm for luck. But everyone knows what it really means. You can almost hear the whispers crawl through the rigging. And in a place where gossip is deadlier than disease, that kind of attention could sink you faster than cannon fire. It's easy, centuries later, to think of these sailors as hardened warriors, sunburned, foul-mouthed, and always spoiling for a fight. But beneath the grime and bravado, they were still people, lonely, hopeful, terrified of dying without ever being known. That's the untold part. The Age of Sail wasn't just a story of exploration. It was a story of endurance, of hearts squeezed between duty and desire. And when you live in a wooden world surrounded by nothing but sea, the smallest glance can feel like rebellion, and the slightest touch can feel like salvation. Let's be honest. When was the last time you were truly alone with a group of people for months, without phones, without privacy, without escape. Imagine every emotion, anger, fear, affection, bottled up until it has nowhere to go. On a ship, it always finds a way. That's not modern psychology talking. Even captains wrote about it. Admiral Lord Collingwood once grumbled in his log about strange attachments among midshipmen that undermine discipline. Strange attachments. That's how history hides what it can't explain. But there's another layer, the unspoken hierarchy of who could get away with what. Officers might look the other way if the culprit was skilled with the ropes or the cannons. Common sailors weren't so lucky. Some records show that courts-martial dealt harshly with unnatural acts, but the same archives reveal hundreds of cases quietly dropped, conveniently forgotten when the fleet needed every man alive. So was it hypocrisy? Or was it a quiet recognition that humanity leaks through even the tightest discipline? You can decide that one. The ocean itself didn't care, of course. It swallowed saints and sinners alike. But the ship was a floating world with its own gravity, its own rules of affection and fear. Think of it like a dormitory that never sleeps, where every sigh can be heard through the wall, and every secret has legs. And yet, in that claustrophobic mess, something tender survived. Men shared stories of home-patched each other's wounds, guarded each other's reputations. You can almost imagine them watching the same stars you see tonight, wondering if they'd ever be understood. And that's where it begins, not in scandal or rebellion, but in the slow erosion of distance, saltwater dissolving boundaries until what was forbidden starts to look like survival. The age of sail may have been ruled by kings and admirals, but below deck, a quieter, more human history unfolded, one that smelled of tar, tasted of salt, and whispered beneath the sound of waves. You wake up to the slap of a rope against the mast and a smell that could knock out a mule. Welcome to life before the mast, the part of a ship reserved for everyone not born into privilege. You're wedged into a narrow wooden coffin called a hammock, swinging just a few feet from the next man's nose. Privacy. That's a fantasy, as distant as dry land. If you turn over too quickly, you'll probably elbow someone's ribs or kick a foot dangling below. And when the ship pitches, all those hammocks sway together, a slow, synchronized rhythm that makes the whole lower deck feel alive, breathing, and strangely intimate. Days are long and repetitive. You haul ropes, scrub decks, patch sails, and listen to the endless groan of the hull. The only break in monotony is food time, a lump of salted beef that could chip a tooth, or a biscuit so old you could use it as a weapon. No one talks about personal space because everyone knows it doesn't exist. It's in this suffocating closeness that something curious happens. Friendship deepens into something softer, quieter. No one calls it love. They call it loyalty or mateship, or simply keeping each other alive. At night, after the lamps are doused, the only light is the faint glow of moon through the hatch. You lie awake, hearing the soft murmurs of others, talking in low voices, jokes, memories, confessions. It's in those whispers that trust is built. And sometimes, trust slips into tenderness. How could it not? When the world shrinks to a 120-foot ship, and every storm reminds you how fragile life is, affection becomes its own kind of rebellion. There's a real case recorded in 1762 aboard the Princess Royal, where two sailors were caught sharing a hammock. The official record just says, "Conduct unbecoming." That's it. No names, no gory details. Just a bureaucratic shrug. Maybe the officers didn't want scandal. Maybe they understood that in a place where death was a daily possibility, companionship was not luxury, it was survival gear. One historian later remarked that the Navy seemed to understand the practical need for human affection, even if it could never say so aloud. You might wonder how the men justified it to themselves. They didn't have the vocabulary we do now. No sexuality, no orientation. Those words didn't exist yet. What they had were bonds, shared danger, shared work, and a kind of closeness that only forms when every day could be your last. To modern eyes, it might look like romance. To them, it was something nameless, but deeply felt. If you think about it, it's not so different from modern soldiers stationed for months in isolated bases or oil rig crews, living together on platforms miles from shore. The body finds company where it can, the heart even more so. You can hear echoes of that truth in sailors' songs too, those endless sea shanties that kept rhythm during labor. Listen closely and you'll catch lines about longing and a handsome lad waiting ashore. Most listeners laugh it off as humor, but sailors knew better. The ocean doesn't judge. It just keeps your secrets. And speaking of secrets, you start noticing small signs that only the crew seems to understand. A shared pipe passed hand to hand, a carved token swapped before night. Watch a private joke that never reaches the officer's ears. Those gestures form a quiet language, a way to say, "I see you," without ever speaking the words. It's not written anywhere, but every sailor learns it. It's the same kind of coded behavior you'd see later in portside taverns or London's molly houses, but out here, miles from shore, it's survival art. The irony is that the Navy depended on that closeness. The more bonded the crew, the better they fought. So even if an officer suspected something improper, he often chose not to notice as long as the ship ran smoothly. It's a strange balance, punishment in principle, tolerance in practice. That's how systems survive, by pretending not to see the humanity that keeps them running. One night, the wind dies. The ship drifts silent, except for the groan of ropes and the creak of wood. You lie awake, staring into the dark, hearing another man's slow breathing a few feet away. There's no fear, no guilt, just a sense that in this floating wooden world, connection is the only thing real. And while the logbooks will never write it down, history has a way of remembering even when people don't. Morning light spills through the hatch, slicing thin golden lines across the deck. You're up early, not because you want to be, but because the bosun's whistle doesn't care about sleep. As you stretch, you notice the small signs again, the coded gestures that mean everything and nothing at the same time. A glance held a heartbeat too long. A song whistled with an extra note slipped in the middle. A hand brushing against another's sleeve under the pretense of passing rope. Welcome to the unspoken language of sailors a secret dialect born out of danger and the need to survive desire in silence. It's funny how the Navy thought it could control everything. Movement, food even thought through prayer and drills. But they couldn't control glances. You can flog a man for theft, lock him up for mutiny, but you can't punish the way someone's eyes linger. The ships of the 18th century were floating fortresses, yes, but also floating theaters where every crew member learned to act. You might not win an Oscar, but you'd certainly learn to hide your lines well. Coded signals were everything. In port, sailors had their own slangs and symbols, but out here on the open ocean, it became art. Some historians describe shared tobacco pipes or gift exchanges that were far more than innocent gestures. Passing a carved shell or silver coin could mean, "I trust you." Sharing a hammock without the excuse of illness could mean, "I see you." A handkerchief left tied to the rigging, that could be an invitation or a warning, depending on who noticed. There's even an old superstition that sailors carried certain knots for luck, tiny rope charms sometimes worn around the wrist. To an outsider, just another sailor's habit. But between those who knew the knot's shape could carry a hidden meaning. A single loop for friendship, a double for loyalty, a figure 8 knot. That one whispered something softer, riskier. You can almost imagine two men at work, their fingers brushing as they tie it, both pretending it's just seamanship. Why all this secrecy? Because naval law was ruthless. Buggery, as the court called it, was one of the few crimes punishable by death. Yet actual executions were rare. Most cases were quietly dismissed or sent below the captain's attention. It's as if the system itself couldn't bear to face what it feared most, that affection existed even in its most disciplined ranks. The logs that do survive are tellingly vague. Improper behavior, indecent familiarity, always written in cold ink, never in human words. You start to realize how these quiet codes weren't just rebellion, they were protection. When speech could hang, you gestures became the only safe confession. In a way, it's not unlike the coded signals used by underground communities centuries later. Flowers, colors, or phrases that mean everything to those in the know, and nothing to outsiders. The Age of Sail's hidden language may have been the earliest ancestor of those systems born not in cities, but on the decks of ships, rocking in endless gray water. And music, oh music, was the safest code of all. A bawdy verse sung on deck could sound like crude humor to officers. But between lines of rum and rope, you'd find something else. Shanties often carried layers. One verse for rhythm, another for camaraderie, and sometimes tucked between rhymes, a longing only the right ears caught. Some old versions of the handsome cabin boy describe a sailor's fondness for the boy, before realizing she was a maid in disguise. Historians debate whether that was just comic twist or plausible deniability, a way to keep singing about affection between men without getting lashed for it. There's an odd comfort in knowing how clever people can be under oppression. The same hands that tied sails and patched hulls also built entire systems of quiet communication, invisible to authority. Think about it. These were men who couldn't read or write, yet they developed a semiotics of survival. They turned glances into grammar, silence into syntax. Sometimes, when the captain's asleep, and the stars burn sharp and clear. You sense it, the shared understanding humming below the noise of waves. It's not loud, not revolutionary, but it's there, pulsing under the surface, like a secret heartbeat. Every ship in the fleet carries its own quiet current of connection, invisible, yet undeniable. The sailors don't need to name it, because naming it would kill it. The sea already knows, and that's enough. They said discipline was the backbone of the Navy, but out here, it's more like a whip wrapped in salt. You can hear it crack even when it's not swinging. The Royal Navy prided itself on order, spotless decks, precise drills, and obedience sharper than the cutlass at your hip. But beneath all that structure lay a fear that desire could rot discipline from within. The irony. The stricter the rules became, the more life found ways to break them. Imagine being punished not for what you did, but for what someone thinks they saw in your eyes. That's how fragile truth was at sea. The word sodomy hovered over every deck like a ghost. It wasn't about evidence, it was about whispers. A jealous crewmate, a bored officer, even a joke gone wrong could turn into a trial. And the trials themselves were theater. The 1806 court-martial of Captain Edward Rigby, for instance, was less about proof and more about humiliation. Rigby's men testified that he spoke fondly to certain midshipmen and lingered in company too long. No witness claimed to have seen anything. Their accusations were built from tone and timing, yet he was stripped of command. The Navy wanted examples, moral warnings more than justice. Still, hypocrisy was the sea's favorite pastime. The same captains who condemned sailors for immorality might quietly tolerate it when it kept the crew calm. Admiral John Jervis once admitted in a letter that he suspected attachments among his men, but would not trouble with inquiry so long as duties are performed. Translation. If it helps morale, don't ask, don't tell. That phrase didn't start in the 20th century. It floated on ships long before politics caught up. You start noticing how strange the hierarchy is. The higher the rank, the more forgiveness you get. Ordinary seamen expendable. Midshipmen, potential officers worth a quiet warning. Captains untouchable unless scandal reached the newspapers. The law said equality under God. The Navy said equality stops at the quarterdeck. Even in punishment class ruled the sea. And when punishments came, they came hard. The lash tore skin open, not just to hurt, but to shame. Public floggings turned discipline into spectacle. 200 men forced to watch one body bleed. But not every sentence ended in blood. Many offenders were simply transferred to other ships, their records erased. A quiet shuffle in the logbook, and history moved on. That's how most stories disappeared. Not through violence, but through bureaucracy. Yet for all that cruelty, there were cracks in the facade. Some officers, rare ones, saw compassion as a kind of command. Take Captain Edward Pellew, later Lord Exmouth, who once spared a young sailor accused of indecent familiarity. In his private journal, he wrote that the boy's conduct shows folly more than vice. That single line speaks volumes. Even those in power knew that the heart doesn't always follow orders. You can feel the tension every day on deck, the push and pull between desire and discipline. Sailors march in line, salute the flag, But behind those rehearsed gestures lies something raw. A glance too long, a laugh too loud, and suddenly the world can tilt. You start walking a fine line between being part of the crew and being noticed by it. Survival means mastering restraint not just of body, but of expression. There's a cruel symmetry in how the Navy worked. It demanded emotional control, yet thrived on emotional bonds. Ships ran on trust. You couldn't fire a cannon or climb a mast without it. So, how could the same system condemn intimacy while depending on it? It's a paradox historians still wrestle with. The answer might be simple. Institutions need loyalty, but they fear love. Loyalty obeys orders. Love chooses its own compass. Sometimes, when night falls and discipline relaxes, you hear laughter from below deck. Carefree, almost childlike. The officers pretend not to hear. Tomorrow the drills will resume the punishments too, but for a few hours, humanity gets the upper hand. You can almost imagine one of those men whispering a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for another dawn. And maybe that's the hidden truth of discipline at sea. It was never just about control. It was about fear of chaos, fear of softness, fear that in a world ruled by violence and wind affection might be the one force truly unstoppable. You've had enough of king's whips and polished boots. So when a ship's boy whispers that a privateer's crew is looking for men, good pay, better rum, no sermons, you sign on. The next morning, you're standing on the deck of the Revenant, staring at a black flag flapping against a sunrise so bright it feels like blasphemy. The men here don't salute. They grin. They curse the crown. They call the captain by his first name. For the first time, you feel like you can breathe without asking permission. Pirate ships weren't floating democracies out of romance novels. They were born from desperation. But in that desperation grew something remarkable: equality. Every man had a vote. Loot was split according to a signed article, not birthright. Captains were elected and could be deposed by majority. The quartermaster acted as a kind of parliament. Even punishment was decided collectively. And with that new balance of power came a kind of moral looseness that scandalized empires. You quickly realize pirates cared less about sin and more about loyalty. Historian Barry Berg once called them brotherhoods of survival, and he wasn't exaggerating. On ships, where every man risked death weekly, what mattered was trust. Who would fight beside you? Who would share the last drink of water? Love, affection, or even something that looked suspiciously like both, nobody cared. As long as you did your job and didn't betray the crew. One famous example hides in plain sight. Olivier Levasseur, the French pirate nicknamed La Bouse. His quartermaster, nicknamed Pierre le Compagnon, appears in multiple journals as his closest associate, though none dare say more. Another rumor trails around Bartholomew Roberts, the elegant Welsh pirate known for wearing crimson coats and quoting scripture. His men wrote songs about his favorite lad, a young sailor named George Wilson. History conveniently forgot to ask why the captain risked mutiny to spare that one boy's life after a failed raid near Suriname. And then there's Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the most famous exceptions to every rule. Disguised as men, they fought alongside Calico Jack Rackham's crew in 1720. Witnesses at their trial later claimed the women showed great fondness towards certain shipmates who never realized their secret until the hangman came. Their story isn't just rebellion, it's a reminder that gender itself blurred when freedom ruled the waves. Outlaws rewrote categories long before philosophers had names for them. It's strange, isn't it? How stepping outside the law could feel more human than living inside it. Pirates, in all their blood and chaos, ended up creating accidental havens where men could exist beyond the moral codes of empire. Not saints, not sinners, just sailors finding comfort in a world that refused to give them any. Some crews even had unwritten rules protecting companionships. They didn't call it marriage, but the practice of matelotage came close. Two men could share property split earnings and look after each other's affairs if one died. In the Caribbean, especially among French buccaneers, it was common enough that colonial authorities complained it encouraged unnatural bonds. That phrase, again, unnatural. Yet to the men living it, there was nothing more natural than having someone to watch your back. When you think about it, pirates were the ultimate contradiction. Brutal and tender, democratic and deadly. They plundered ships, yet protected each other fiercely. They drank to excess, yet honored loyalty with near sacred devotion. Maybe that's why the image of the pirate still lingers, not just as a villain, but as a symbol of radical freedom. Because when you live outside the king's law, you start writing your own. You watch the sunset from the quarterdeck, mug of rum in hand. The air smells like tar and citrus, and the sea is calm for once. Around you, the crew laughs rough, genuine laughter that shakes the ship more than the wind. A man strums a battered fiddle, and someone starts singing in French about a brother bound by rope, not by blood. It's crude poetry, but it's real. You realize this is what freedom sounds like. Loud, messy, impossible to legislate. When the moon rises, you notice two men standing near the stern rail. They're just silhouettes against the light shoulders touching, talking softly. No one looks their way. No one cares. The ocean carries their words into the dark, and for once there's no punishment waiting, only another dawn. The sea always takes, but sometimes, just sometimes, it gives something back. You start noticing it in quiet gestures. A shared meal, a steadying hand. When the deck rolls the way, two men find a rhythm, working side by side on the ropes, moving like parts of the same heartbeat. No fanfare, no confession, just connection. Love in the age of sail didn't arrive in poems or letters. It arrived disguised as survival. There's a saying among sailors, every storm reveals who you are. And when the storms hit, when masts snapped and cannons rolled loose, the truth surfaced like wreckage. One ship's surgeon recorded how a sailor named James Bailey threw himself overboard to rescue his mate Thomas after a squall tore through the Indian Ocean. Bailey didn't make it. The logbook simply notes, "Lost a good man, faithful to the last." No mention of why he dove in. History doesn't like love stories that don't fit the script. But between the lines of those journals, you start to see it, the small, stubborn humanity that refused to die, even at sea. Imagine a world without privacy, without safety, where you could be executed for feeling affection. And yet they risked it anyway. Not for rebellion, not for politics, just for a few moments, of being known. Some stories survived because the captains were too superstitious to erase them. One log from 1739 mentions two sailors caught carving hearts into a gun carriage. The officer who found them had them flogged, but later wrote in his journal that their conduct was more tender than vile. He couldn't bring himself to call it evil. That's the paradox. You can condemn in daylight and still understand in the dark. You wonder what those men thought during the long night watches when the sea stretched endless and the stars burned cold. Maybe they talked about home, or maybe they stopped pretending to have one. For sailors, the ship was home, a place where friendship blurred into something deeper, where care itself became contraband. When the world calls you sinful for needing comfort, every act of kindness becomes resistance. There's a peculiar tenderness in how these men remembered each other. On their bodies, they carried tattoos, names, initials, dates that look ordinary to us, but once spoke volumes. Tom's anchor, Jack's rope my lad forever. The designs weren't decoration. They were secret vows, inked under the skin. Each drop of ink said I was here. I was loved, even if no one writes it down. Sometimes, when the ship reached port, those connections ended in silence. One stayed, the other sailed. No promises, no letters, just a nod that said, we lived through it. But a few, very few, carried their bonds ashore. In Havana, there's a court record from 1701 describing two sailors who deserted together, living as brothers in a rented house until their arrest. Their possessions: two hammocks, a Bible, and a shared tobacco pipe. It's almost domestic, almost normal, except that normality itself was the crime. And then there were moments of tragedy, so intimate you can feel them centuries later. During the wreck of the Wager in 1741, a survivor named Isaac Morris recalled seeing two lads clasped together, perished in embrace. He didn't describe them as lovers, but the image doesn't leave your mind. Amid chaos, they held on not to life, but to each other. It's strange how the sea, for all its cruelty, became the safest witness. The waves don't record, don't judge. They just take the stories and carry them somewhere beyond reach. Maybe that's why so many of these loves vanished, because the ocean kept them. You stand by the railing one evening, watching phosphorescence sparkle beneath the hull. Each shimmer feels like a name unspoken, a memory rising for just a second before it's gone again. You realize something: history isn't just written by victors. It's also written by survivors who dared to feel in a world built to punish it. Those men didn't fight for identity. They fought for the right to be human in a place that tried to turn them into machines of war and work. And when you finally close your eyes, lulled by the groan of timbers and the slap of waves, you understand why they risked everything for affection that couldn't be named. Because even in the harshest world, love still found a way to whisper through the noise, to exist between ropes, rations, and rules. The sea, brutal as it was, never drowned it completely. The moment the anchor drops, temptation begins. The ship might belong to the king, but the port belongs to nobody. And that's exactly how the sailors like it. The smell hits you first: rum sweat and roasted fish. Then the noise, a constant roar of laughter, bargaining, music, and mischief. Port towns, in the age of sail, were the world's first melting pots. Men from Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas rubbing shoulders in streets slick with spilled beer and sin. For months, sailors lived like ghosts. Now, they come back to life. And among the taverns, theaters, and brothels, a strange kind of freedom blooms, temporary, intoxicating, and always at risk of vanishing with the tide. You follow the crowd into a dockside tavern in Port Royal, Jamaica. It's barely standing, a shack nailed together from stolen planks, but it's packed to the rafters. Drunken voices belt out sea shanties while a fiddler saws away in the corner. A few men wear women's scarves and laugh at their own performance. At first you think it's just part of the joke, but then one leans close to another, and the laughter shifts into something softer. No one blinks. In this corner of empire disguise isn't mockery, it's permission. Ports were where rules loosened and identities blurred. In Havana, in Manila, in London's Wapping district, men found ways to exist that the Navy could never allow on deck. There were taverns known for their pretty sailors' theaters, where ladies with suspiciously deep voices sang torch songs, and boarding houses where rent included companionship. Everyone pretended not to know, and that pretending was its own kind of agreement. The most infamous of these places were the Molly houses of London, part tavern, part social club, part sanctuary. Men met there not just for sex, but for community. Some dressed as women, taking names like Miss Kitten or Lady Fancy, staging mock marriages and christenings. To outsiders it was scandal. To them, it was relief. And while the Navy officially condemned it, sailors were frequent guests. After months at sea, under brutal discipline, who wouldn't want to spend an evening where laughter and softness weren't crimes? You might imagine these spaces as chaotic dens of sin, but they were often tender, even domestic. In one account, from 1726, a constable raided a Molly house and found two men sitting quietly by a fire, holding hands and calling each other husband. He wrote it down like a confession. They probably thought it was love. Outside of Europe, port towns mixed cultures in ways that baffled authorities. In Southeast Asia, for example, European sailors encountered local customs that didn't share their taboos. In the Philippines, the Spanish crown complained about unruly behavior between sailors and native men who served as interpreters and laborers. The crown's own letters reveal a quiet panic, not just about morality, but about empire itself. How do you maintain European superiority when your own men blur the lines of gender and loyalty overseas? There's also evidence that in the Caribbean, maroon communities, escaped slaves, and indigenous allies offered refuge to deserters of all kinds, including those fleeing charges of sodomy. These fugitives became part of new societies built on freedom and necessity, where survival mattered more than conformity. If the Navy was the iron cage of empire, the ports were its leaks, places where forbidden humanity seeped out and refused to be contained. Of course, not every encounter ended in romance or safety. Port life was dangerous. Disease, exploitation, and betrayal were as common as song. But even in that chaos, something sacred persisted, the possibility of being seen, even if only for one night, without judgment. In a world of punishment and pretense, that was no small miracle. You watch as dawn creeps into the harbor. The tavern is quiet now, its laughter spent. A sailor stumbles outside with smudged rouge on his cheeks. Another hums a shanty about a love that wears no name. Behind them ships creak, and gulls scream like alarms. Soon the whistle will blow, and everyone will return to their masks, the officers glare, the seamen swagger. But for a few hours, they were free, and freedom, even brief, can change a man forever. You walk back toward your ship, sand clinging to your boots, the smell of rum and salt following you. Somewhere behind the laughter fades, but it leaves an echo, a reminder that history's forbidden corners weren't always sad. Sometimes they were just hidden, waiting for the tide to turn again. You think you've seen every kind of contradiction the sea can offer. Then empire steps in to make it worse. The age of sail wasn't just about trade routes and treasure. It was about exporting morality. Every time a ship left London, Lisbon, or Madrid, it carried not only guns and goods, but also laws thick, holy, and hypocritical. Those laws said what kind of love counted, what kind of body was civilized, and who had the right to exist. Yet the ocean had other ideas. When the British, Spanish, and Dutch spread their flags across the tropics, they also spread their fears. They called it purity. They built churches beside brothels, prisons beside ports. On paper, the colonies were extensions of Christian order. In practice, they were pressure cookers of human behavior. Sailors, soldiers, and locals mixed in ways the governors couldn't control. The empire tried to keep its hierarchies straight. The world below deck kept blurring them. Records from Manila tell you how Spanish officials constantly scolded their own sailors for moral disorder with the Indios. In reality, it wasn't just about sex. It was about power, unraveling. When Spanish officers wrote of unmanly softness among their men, they weren't just policing desire. They were policing empire. Because what happens to hierarchy when a white sailor finds tenderness or equality with someone the empire calls lesser? It threatens the whole story of conquest, and yet the colonies became accidental sanctuaries. In Jamaica, runaway sailors mixed with Maroons, creating small coastal camps where rules were rewritten daily. In India, the British East India Company struggled to enforce its moral codes, while its own officers kept local companions of every possible gender. Some of those relationships were transactional. Others lasted decades. Captain William Hickey, for instance, lived openly with a male servant he described as his dearest companion. His journals soften whenever he mentions the man's name, as if the ink itself blushed. Then there was the Dutch East Indies, where officials wrote furious reports about sodomitical scandals in Batavia, now Jakarta. They punished some exiled others, but they never managed to stop it. You can sense their frustration between the lines. The East is corrupting European virtue. Translation: the East simply revealed what Europe already feared about itself. You start to realize empire's biggest lie was control. It wanted the world neat, classified, moral. But the sea connected everything it tried to separate. Cultures collided, languages merged, and love ignored the paperwork. You can trace it in the very slang sailors used: Malay, Portuguese, English, and Swahili words mashed together into dockside dialects. Even the insult bugger comes from Bulgarian, twisted by centuries of fear into shorthand for sin. The word itself carries the echo of how empire translated difference into deviance. Meanwhile, in London and Amsterdam, newspapers screamed about scandalous behavior among colonial crews returning home. They painted these men as corrupted gone native. Yet back in the ports, those same sailors were welcomed for their stories and souvenirs. It's almost comedic condemn them, abroad celebrate them at home. The empire wanted its sailors to conquer, not to feel. But the ocean always had a way of teaching empathy through exhaustion, longing, and survival. It's worth asking if you were trapped at sea for months crossing worlds that no longer fit your map. What would your morals look like? Maybe the ocean didn't corrupt anyone. Maybe it freed them. Out there away from churches and courts, you lived by necessity, not ideology. That's what frightened the people who wrote the laws. The realization that freedom doesn't need permission. Even navies began to change in small, quiet ways. The British eventually replaced death sentences for unnatural acts with prison, or flogging a shift that said less about mercy and more about exhaustion. The empire couldn't afford to hang half its workforce, and while they never admitted it, tolerance crept in covert, reluctant, but real. A wink here, a blind eye there, humanity surviving through loopholes. When you walk the decks at night now, you notice something different. The flags above you don't just mark nations, they mark contradictions. Spanish crosses, British lions, Dutch tridents, all symbols of conquest, fluttering over men who in the darkness defy everything those emblems stand for. You realize that empire was built on illusion, the real world. The one sweating, singing, and dreaming below deck belonged to nobody. And maybe that was its quiet revenge. The Age of Sail was supposed to prove Europe's dominance. Instead, it revealed its fragility. For every law written in ink, the ocean washed away 1,000 acts of tenderness written in salt. The ships carried conquest outward, but love, stubborn and unsinkable, sailed right back in. The wind dies down, and someone starts humming a low, wordless tune that rolls through the dark like a lullaby for the damned. You've heard hundreds of sea shanties by now, but this one's different. No bawdy jokes, no chorus about rum or plunder. Just a soft melody rising from the forecastle where an old sailor sharpens a knife that hasn't seen action in weeks. He sings of a fair young hand before the mast, and everyone joins in pretending it's just a song. But you can hear it, can't you? The longing between the lines. Music was the sailor's diary, carved in sound instead of ink. You couldn't write what you felt without risking the noose, but you could hide it in a tune. The handsome cabin boy Johnny come down to Hilo Spanish ladies, each one a puzzle box of meaning. To officers, they were harmless work songs. To the crew, they were therapy. The verses changed with every voyage. Sometimes the cabin boy turned out to be a girl in disguise. Sometimes the singer never revealed the twist at all. Ambiguity kept you safe and kept you sane. If you close your eyes, you can still hear them today. Not the polite museum versions, but the raw, unpolished ones, sung through cracked throats. The ones where laughter and heartbreak share the same rhythm. Music was the only place sailors could tell the truth without being accused of it. One verse might praise my handsome Jack. Another toast the lad with eyes like blue silk rope. No one asked questions. The song carried them farther than the ship ever could. Myths carried the rest. Every fleet had ghost stories about doomed lovers, two sailors lashed together in a storm, their bodies found entwined after the wreck. a cabin boy who leapt into the sea when his friend was hanged for mutiny, a voice heard singing in fog long after its owner vanished. The officers called it superstition. The crew called it memory. When you have no grave to visit, a story becomes your cemetery. It's easy to romanticize it now, but for the men who lived it, myth was protection. It kept their names alive in ways the logbooks never could. Even when the church tried to scrub away unnatural vice ballads, kept it humming under the surface. You can find their traces in maritime archives, half-erased verses penciled out, then written back in a different hand. Someone always wanted the song to survive. There's even a peculiar legend from the South Pacific sailors who drowned in forbidden love were said to turn into man-o'-war jellyfish, floating forever together under the waves. Every time a sailor spotted a pair of them drifting side by side, he'd whisper, "The lads are still sailing." You might laugh, but out there between fear and faith, stories like that were lifelines. They made sense of loss in a world where loss was routine. And then there were the rituals, the toasts, the secret handshakes, the strange nicknames that disguised affection as humor. Sweethearts of the sea, my bunk brother, my shadow. Every ship had them. Every man knew when to laugh and when to pretend he didn't hear. You realize these weren't just sailors. They were curators of coded folklore, inventing queer mythology long before anyone used the word. Even official art and literature couldn't resist. When sailors returned home, they told tales to writers who cleaned them up for polite audiences. The lonely sailor became a romantic symbol, stripped of context, but still haunted by truth. Lord Byron, who spent years at sea, wrote poems thick with yearning and friendship. Herman Melville, later in the century, turned that coded affection into novels. Queer longing didn't disappear when the sails came down, it just changed its disguise. You wonder how many of those old songs you know without realizing what they mean. How many tunes once whispered love between men before they were sanitized for tourists and school choirs. You might even hum one now, without thinking, tapping your foot as the lyrics float by. That's how survival works. It hides in plain sight until someone finally listens again. The old sailor finishes his song, his voice cracking on the last line, no grave, but the deep blue sea. The others echo it softly, almost reverently. For a moment, the ship feels like a church. No priests, no sermons, just the rhythm of oars and hearts. The ocean listens, and maybe, just maybe, remembers. The ocean never forgets it, just buries its memories beneath new waves, waiting for someone brave or sleepless enough to listen. Centuries have passed since the last great sail unfurled. But when you walk along any old harbor, Bristol, Havana, Manila, you can still feel the ghosts breathing through the salt air. The age of sail has ended yet. Its untold stories drift just below the surface, like wrecks that refuse to sink. And if you listen carefully to the creak of old masts turned into museum pieces, or to the sea wind whistling through rigging ropes left for tourists, you might catch whispers of the lives that were never written down. Historians now dig through court-martials' letters and ship logs to reconstruct what polite society erased. They find traces of a captain's unusual leniency, a sailor's carved initials beside another's bunk. A song line changed mid-verse. These fragments don't shout, they murmur. Each one reminds you that love existed even where it wasn't allowed to speak. And sometimes, all history needs is someone willing to listen to the murmurs. You can almost picture it, a modern researcher hunched under lamplight reading through a brittle logbook dated 1720. The ink is fading, but there it is, a simple note two men found embracing. Punished, though, neither cried out. The historian pauses, pen trembling, because in that dry official entry lies something alive, dignity, devotion, and pain, all stripped of names but heavy with humanity. These are the moments where the past stops being distant and starts breathing again. And isn't that what makes this story matter? Not the punishments, not the laws, but the resilience of feeling itself. You see it echo today in the language of sailors, words like mate, shipmate, brother, still carrying a tenderness they can't quite explain. You hear it in sea shanties, revived on social media, sung by people who don't even know they're repeating coded love songs from 300 years ago. The ocean, it seems, has found a new chorus. There's something poetic about how the same waters that once hid these stories now connect us through fiber cables and digital tides. You scroll through your screen at midnight, watching a clip of modern sailors laughing on deck, or a group of historians piecing together fragments of a forgotten romance. The irony is perfect. Centuries ago, love at sea had to hide in symbols. Now, its descendants tell it to millions. The sea hasn't changed. It's still vast, secretive, untamable, but we have. Sometimes, you wonder if the men who once carved hearts into ship rails ever imagined a future where their quiet rebellion would be remembered as courage. They didn't write manifestos. They didn't march. They just held each other when the world was cold and called it survival. But history has a way of rewarding the small acts that outlast cruelty. Every whisper under canvas, every forbidden song, every shared glance beneath starlight, they all ripple outward, century by century, until they reach you. Even the languages of the sea remember. Sailor slang full of old affection survived empire and censorship alike. Sweetheart wasn't always for women. Mate didn't always mean comrade. The words stretch like old ropes, still carrying the fingerprints of the men who used them to mean, I trust you, I miss you, I'm still here. And maybe that's the point. Nothing human ever really disappears. It just changes. Its uniform crosses another horizon, waits for a more forgiving wind. The untold history of homosexuality in the age of sail isn't just a tale of secrecy. It's a reminder that connection is one of humanity's oldest instincts, outliving every empire that tried to crush it. You lean against the railing one last time, watching the horizon fade from blue to silver. The waves are calm now, each one carrying a story you'll never fully know. The ships are gone, the laws rewritten, but the sea remains a great, restless archive that never stops recording. Somewhere beneath it all, in the dark between tides, are the echoes of those who dared to love when love was a crime. And as you listen to the soft hiss of waves against the shore, you realize the ocean isn't just water, it's memory. It holds their names, their songs, their silences. It always has. And tonight, it rocks you gently, like it once rocked them, whispering in its slow, endless voice, "You are not the first, and you will not be the last." Beneath the romance of tall ships lay a hidden world of forbidden affection, men bound by salt silence and survival. Yet where tenderness existed, cruelty followed close behind. The same ocean that sheltered secret love also witnessed brutal control. Now, you'll step deeper into that darkness, the dark reality of punishment and discipline at sea. You step aboard thinking you've joined an adventure, but within a week, you realize you've actually enlisted in a floating dictatorship, one that smells like tar sweat and something that used to be soup. Your boots thud on the deck as the boatswain hands you a quill and gestures toward the ship's articles. It looks harmless enough. A bit of parchment, neat handwriting, promises of pay and rations. But here's the trick. The moment you sign, the law of the land stops protecting you. From now on, your entire world is ruled by the code of the sea, a system where a captain's glare weighs more than any judge's verdict. You've just traded courts for quarters, lawyers for lashings. Congratulations, you're property of the ocean now. It's funny how the sea sells freedom while enforcing the strictest kind of order. You imagine modern office life might feel similar, signing a contract that swears you to team spirit while silently binding you to unpaid overtime. Back then, sailors didn't clock out. The watch bell was the only calendar they had. Day or night, you were either working, eating, or being yelled at for how you were working or eating. The Articles of War, especially on Navy ships, read like a sermon written by someone allergic to joy. Disobedience, flogging. Sleeping on duty. Flogging, losing a piece of rope. Half rations, and probably flogging. It's said the Royal Navy carried over 30 separate offenses that could earn you a taste of the whip, and that's not counting creative improvisations. The document was read aloud every Sunday, a kind of floating Bible of misery, just to remind everyone that the ship belonged to the crown, and the crown apparently had a temper. Some sailors joked that signing up meant selling your soul for salt beef and biscuit. They weren't far off. You got food that could crack a tooth water, that tasted like old coins, and pay that might arrive months late if you lived long enough to collect it. But you couldn't complain, because complaint itself was punishable. The sea didn't like whiners, and captains, they liked them even less. You notice quickly how hierarchy runs deep here. The captain might not be a king on land, but out here he's closer to a god answerable to no one until the ship docks. Officers eat and private drink better rum and sleep in quarters you'd barely fit a hammock in. Below decks, the rest of the crew lies packed like sardines, each hammock swinging inches from the next, the air thick with the perfume of mildew and men. Some captains were fair, but others, like Edward Vernon or the infamous William Bligh, were known for discipline so brutal it could break even the toughest sailors. Bligh's crew famously mutinied on the Bounty in 1789, claiming they'd rather risk the open ocean than one more day under his rule. You can almost picture that scene. The captain shouting orders, the men's faces tight with quiet fury, the moment the line between obedience and rebellion snaps like an overstrained rope. What's remarkable is how normalized it all was. The lash wasn't a scandal, it was routine maintenance. A sailor might get flogged in the morning and be back swabbing the deck by noon. his back bleeding through his shirt, his shipmates pretending not to notice. The logic was simple. Fear keeps the ship afloat. Compassion, they believed, makes it sink. Still, not every man accepted that logic. Some kept tiny rebellions alive, sneaking extra rum, humming forbidden songs, or carving rude caricatures of officers into the timbers. The punishments might take your skin, but they couldn't quite erase humor. And humor, oddly enough, became the sailor's last defense. Now, as the sun sets behind the mast, you look around and realize how easily discipline disguises itself as order, and how quickly rules meant for survival can become tools for control. The sea is calm for now, but the captain's shadow stretches long across the deck, and somewhere deep in your gut, you start to understand freedom at sea always comes with a chain attached. The morning bell clangs sharp and metallic, dragging you from a dream of quiet harbors. The sea has its own kind of alarm clock, never gentle, always punctual. You stumble onto the deck, where the bosun's whistle cuts through the air like a needle through canvas. That sound is the ship's heartbeat, shrill and commanding, summoning everyone into motion before thought even wakes up. You realize quickly that the whistle isn't just noise, it's language. Out here, tone replaces words, and hesitation is treason. The boatswain, or bosun as the crew calls him, is the captain's voice made flesh, a man whose job is to keep the ship's rhythm steady. His call means scrub, haul, lift, repeat. Each shriek of that whistle divides your day into chores and punishments disguised as chores. You'd be amazed how many varieties of rope-related suffering exist. The sea might look free, but every movement on deck is choreography, and the bosun's whistle writes the music. You start to see how discipline on a ship isn't only about punishment, it's about choreography. The whole vessel functions like a clock made of people, and any gear that hesitates threatens the machine. Think about that next time your boss talks about team synergy. A ship was the original group project, except here, missed deadlines could kill everyone. Above the quarterdeck looms like a balcony in a one-sided play. Officers stroll there with their hands clasped behind their backs, their boots polished, even when there's no one but the seagulls to admire them. Every so often, the first lieutenant barks orders that the bosun translates into movement. It's an elegant little hierarchy command, flows downward like water through cracks, soaking every sailor in authority, until not 1 inch of your shirt is dry of obedience. And then there's the logbook, innocent-looking bound in leather, but deadlier than a sword. Every action, every word, every sneeze that happens out of turn can end up in its pages. A simple entry like neglect of duty could ruin a man's record for life. The log wasn't just memory. It was evidence, a floating courtroom where the judge wrote history in ink before the verdict was spoken aloud. You begin to treat that book with more fear than the sea itself. Still, the ship's system has a strange logic. With hundreds of men packed onto a wooden coffin, miles from any law or witness discipline wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Without it, a ship could dissolve into chaos within hours. Imagine being stuck with co-workers you can't stand, unable to go home while the floor beneath you moves constantly and smells faintly of despair. Suddenly, order feels less like tyranny and more like plumbing. You only notice it when it breaks. The men learn early that tone matters more than volume. Well-timed whistle or glare can prevent a dozen beatings. Captains prize obedience over enthusiasm. It's not passion that keeps sails trimmed and cannons loaded, it's habit. The trick is to train a crew until they react before they think like muscle memory with manners. You overhear stories from older sailors about captains who could command silence with a single raised eyebrow. One even swore that Captain Cook could make a man stop mid-sneeze with just a look. Maybe it's myth, or maybe fear is the world's oldest teacher. After all, punishment at sea wasn't designed just to hurt. It was meant to be seen. A warning carved into someone else's mistake. Sometimes late at night, when the deck is quiet and the lanterns swing low, you catch yourself wondering if the sea hears those whistles too. If somewhere beneath the waves, 1,000 echoes of command are still drifting. Heave, hold, haul like the ghosts of old discipline, refusing to die. And just as that thought fades, the bosun's whistle shrieks again, slicing through the calm. Your hands move automatically. Rope and grip, back bent, brain quiet. It's both obedience and surrender, and you're not sure where one ends and the other begins. There's a joke among sailors that you don't need tattoos to remember your time at sea. The scars will do that for you. The moment you hear the phrase, "all hands to witness punishment," the air itself changes temperature. It's not just an order, it's a ritual. You can feel it ripple through the deck like electricity as men drop what they're doing and gather silently near the mainmast. You follow your stomach sinking because you already know what comes next. Discipline. Aboard ship is equal parts theater and terror. The offender, usually some poor soul caught stealing rum or arguing with an officer, is tied to the grating shirt, stripped off back exposed. The bosun's mates prepare the cat-o'-nine-tails, that infamous whip, with 9 knotted cords. Each strand holds tiny bits of tarred rope or metal that bite deeper than skin. The crowd doesn't cheer, it doesn't dare. Instead, it watches with a quiet that feels heavier than the sea itself. The first lash always sounds louder than you expect. A sharp crack, followed by a hiss as salt air rushes into the wound. It's not just pain, it's performance. Every man on deck is meant to learn something from it. What disobedience costs. What authority looks like. What fear feels like when it's official policy. The bosun counts each stroke aloud, while the captain stands nearby, arms folded, face carved from stone. Some captains read scripture during the flogging as if God himself were part of the crew's disciplinary committee. You wonder how many of these punishments were about justice and how many were simply stress relief for men, trapped too long with the same faces. There's a rhythm to cruelty at sea. It becomes routine sanitized. Officers called flogging the only language sailors understand, which is a bit like saying fire understands gasoline. The truth is, the lash kept order because it reminded everyone that chaos hurt more. Afterward, the deckhands wash the blood with seawater, a detail that sounds merciful until you realize how much salt stings. Some victims faint. Others bite down on rags until their jaws ache. And when it's done, the captain nods, the men disperse, and the punished sailor is told to get back to work. There's no recovery time, no apology. The punishment was never just about pain. It was about erasing hesitation. Occasionally, the lash backfires. A sailor might refuse to cry out, enduring every stroke in silence. That's when the power dynamic flickers. You see the bosun hesitate, unsure who's winning this grotesque contest of endurance. A man who refuses to break can terrify even his tormentors. There are old tales of floggings where the crew started cheering not for the officers, but for the punished. A tiny, dangerous rebellion disguised as applause. If you listen closely, the word discipline itself sounds almost polite. It comes from the same root as disciple, meaning student or follower. But on these decks, lessons were written in bruises, not ink. It's strange, isn't it, how societies always wrap their cruelty in the language of education. Even today, you'll hear people say, he needed discipline, when they mean he needed control. The method just got cleaner. The motive stayed the same. Flogging was so common it shaped naval vocabulary. Kiss the gunner's daughter meant being bent over a cannon for punishment. Starting referred to a light beating for minor offenses. Even humor came from pain. And when a ship's cat was finally worn out, it was ceremoniously tossed overboard, another way of pretending that the cruelty, like the whip itself, could simply sink and vanish. But history doesn't drown so easily. You still find fragments of those lashes in old record sailors' diaries, describing the sound of it, surgeons' notes about the infections that followed. Some even sketched crude drawings in the margins, tiny shaky attempts to remember what the official logs left out. Those sketches, ironically, became the truest records of all. When dusk falls, the ship grows quiet again. The crew eats in silence, the punished man curled in his hammock, breathing shallow. Tomorrow, he'll climb the rigging like nothing happened. Because that's the rule, pain is private, but obedience is public. You realize, then, that the sea doesn't just test muscles, it trains minds. And somewhere between those two, it decides who breaks and who bends. If flogging was the Navy's thunder, then the quiet punishments were its drizzle, less dramatic, but somehow colder, because they didn't end when the clouds cleared. You learn this the hard way after watching a shipmate tied in irons for the sin of speaking back to an officer. The punishment doesn't bleed or scream, it just lasts. Heavy cuffs clamp his ankles together, the metal biting deeper with every roll of the ship. He sits there by the mainmast, a living caution sign, so that everyone else remembers to hold their tongue. The crew steps around him as if he's part of the furniture. Out here, humiliation is public property. Bilboes, they call them iron restraints, used since the age of sail began. The name sounds almost whimsical, doesn't it? But there's nothing merry about steel rubbing skin raw hour after hour. The prisoner eats half rations and sleeps none because every wave slams the cuffs tighter. Some historians say the Navy preferred this to flogging, claiming it was more humane. If that's true, then humanity has a very flexible definition. Then there's the bread and water sentence, a diet so Spartan it could humble even a monk. The offender is kept below deck, given nothing but hard biscuit and a cup of stale water per day, sometimes for a week straight. By the third day, your gums ache, your stomach shrinks, and your mind starts playing tricks, imagining roasted meat every time the galley smoke drifts by. You'd almost prefer the lash, at least pain ends. Hunger lingers. Captains liked these slow punishments because they didn't interrupt the ship's operations. A flogged man might need a surgeon, A man in irons still swabs decks with limited mobility, a 2-for-1 deal in maritime management. Cruelty meet efficiency. And yet, even in such misery, sailors found humor. You hear one whisper to another, "Better irons than airless heaven." Another adds, "Ain't no sin worth double bread rations." Laughter brittle as salt crystals ricochets between the masts. Sometimes joking was the only way to keep from cracking entirely. But not every punishment came with shackles. Some were invisible, carved into the routines themselves. A sailor caught dozing during night watch might be assigned double duty for a week less sleep, more shouting. Others lost rum privileges, a cruel blow, when rum was the only warmth in endless cold. You start to see the pattern. Every punishment was really a reminder that you belonged to someone else's timetable. In this floating world, fairness depended entirely on who was looking. Some captains prided themselves on measured justice. They'd lecture before punishment, reminding the crew that discipline keeps us alive. And they weren't wrong. Without strict order, a ship could fall apart faster than a sandcastle in a tide. But other captains, the ones history conveniently forgets, used discipline as theater punishments performed not for correction, but for control. One record from 1767 describes a lieutenant who kept a man in irons for 8 days just because he hummed during inspection. Another, from a Dutch East India ship, tells of sailors forced to wear signs reading idler or blasphemer while working. Public shame as performance art. Makes you think, did the captains learn this from kings? Or did the kings learn it from them? It's strange how the logic of punishment at sea mirrors the logic of punishment anywhere. Even today, there's something eerily familiar about it. Offices that freeze people out instead of firing them. Systems that starve morale instead of feeding progress. Different settings, same psychology. Make the example visible so everyone else stays obedient. Some nights, you pass the man in irons and hear him whispering to himself, counting the stars like they're days left in his sentence. You don't stop. You don't speak. You both know that sympathy is contagious and compassion can be mistaken for mutiny. Still, part of you wonders how a world so vast can feel so small. Above deck, the captain paces like a restless god, and below the sea hums its steady rhythm of indifference. The ocean doesn't care who's in irons, who's in command, or who's pretending to be both. It just keeps moving, patient and eternal, washing over cruelty like it's another kind of weather. You've seen the lash, you've seen the irons, and yet the sea still has darker tricks hidden below its shimmering surface. Sailors whisper them like ghost stories when the night watch stretches too long, tales of keel-hauling, ducking, and running the gauntlet. They say half of them are myths, the other half too true to be repeated loudly. You're about to learn that on a ship, rumor is often just cruelty rehearsing its next encore. Keel hauling, for example, sounds almost impossible until you realize how much creativity authority can muster when left unsupervised. Picture it, a man tied with ropes dragged beneath the ship from one side to the other, scraping against barnacles sharp as razors. The sea, of course, doesn't care whether it's punishing or cleansing. It simply swallows and spits. The Dutch were infamous for this method in the 17th century, and though the Royal Navy later called it barbaric, later didn't help the ones already dragged beneath. But here's the twist. Keel hauling wasn't common precisely because it didn't need to be. The idea of it was enough. The mere mention could quiet a deck faster than prayer. Sailors feared the sea more than the whip, and captains use that fear like currency. Why spend effort when imagination will do the work? Then there were the duckings, a milder cousin, if you can call forced near drowning mild. A sailor accused of theft or blasphemy might be hoisted up and plunged repeatedly into the ocean. Sometimes the punishment accidentally continued until bubbles stopped rising. Captains shrugged. Accidents happen at sea. The ocean made an excellent accomplice because it never testified. Another favorite of naval lore was running the gauntlet. On some ships, a crewman who offended his mate stealing rations, slacking during storms, had to walk the length of the deck while every sailor struck him with knotted cords or belaying pins. It was democracy, with a vengeance communal justice that bled unity and revenge together. You'd think men beaten daily by officers would show mercy to one another, but cruelty has a way of trickling down the chain of command until everyone finds someone weaker to discipline. And yet for every true horror, there were exaggerations. Sailors loved a grisly story, and historians still argue over how often these punishments really happened. The line between history and myth blurred easily when told over rum. You hear one man swear his cousin was keel-hauled off Madagascar. Another insists he saw a bosun tied to the bowsprit and left to bake in the sun until he confessed. Maybe it happened. Maybe it didn't. The point was never truth. The point was control. Fear doesn't need facts. It just needs witnesses. There's something almost modern in how this fear economy worked. Replace keel hauling with termination. Replace ducking with public shaming. And you'll find the same principle alive in offices and schools today. Humans haven't stopped inventing creative ways to keep one another obedient. They've just improved the branding. You might wonder, were there any limits occasionally? Admiralty courts frowned upon deaths without reason, mostly because dead sailors couldn't work or testify. A captain who went too far risked mutiny or worse paperwork. So discipline walked a narrow plank between fear and function. Too soft, and the crew grew wild. Too hard, and they stopped rowing. The balance was everything. Some captains preferred spectacle over repetition. One infamous commander, Richard Corbett of the Dragon, once had his men hang a mutineer's body in chains from the yardarm for 3 full days, letting the gulls pick him clean. It wasn't personal. It was policy. The body swung like a warning sign in the wind, saying, "This ship remembers." But sailors remembered too in their own ways. They carved crude tattoos of anchors, knives, and ropes on their arms, not as decoration, but as quiet symbols of survival. Each mark whispered, "I lived through this." Maybe that's why the Navy never quite broke them entirely. The lash could scar the skin, the irons could bruise the bone, but memory always found a way to surface again, like a drowned truth that refused to sink. You look at the calm sea and realize how deceptive it is. On the surface, it glows gold under the sun, pretending to be peace itself. But beneath barnacles waits sharp as judgment, and history drifts silently, holding its breath. Some punishments didn't need whips irons or ropes, just exhaustion. You learn quickly that the sea's favorite discipline isn't pain, it's fatigue. The kind that seeps into your bones until your eyelids feel heavier than the anchor chain. When captains wanted to break a sailor without drawing blood, they prescribed extra duty. It sounded harmless enough, an extra watch here, another turn aloft there, but by the third straight night without sleep, you'd start hearing the sea whisper your name. Mastheading, they called it, and sending a sailor to the very top of the mast as a sort of timeout with vertigo. You climb barefoot on rope and spar the wind slicing at your face. The height is dizzying, the deck below shrinking to the size of a playing card. You cling there for hours, legs shaking, trying not to sneeze because even that feels like a death wish. For some offenses, mastheading lasted half a day. For others, until the captain simply remembered you existed. You start wondering which would come first, his mercy or your fall. Then there's extra watch, another punishment disguised as responsibility. A sailor assigned double watch might stay awake for 24 hours straight, steering, scrubbing, or polishing brass until dawn. You think of modern folks bragging about hustle culture and can't help but laugh. Those sailors were the original overworked employees, except no one handed out coffee or paid overtime. You just kept moving until your body forgot how to stop. Sleep deprivation became its own kind of torture. Men would nod off standing up, only to wake when the bosun's cane snapped across their shoulders. The brain plays tricks when it's desperate for rest ropes. Look like snakes, waves, whisper insults, stars, rearrange themselves into mocking faces. The ship becomes a haunted house made of fatigue, and yet somehow you keep working because the alternative disobedience hurts more. Still, not all captains were monsters. Some understood that fear alone can't run a ship. They mixed discipline with incentives, rewarding good behavior with rum tobacco, or the rare privilege of a full night's sleep. You see, the smartest officers realized something modern managers are still learning. Tired men make stupid mistakes. And at sea, stupidity can kill faster than mutiny. There's an account of Admiral Nelson walking the deck before battle, greeting his men, by name praising their precision. His charisma made them fight harder than any threat ever could. Not everyone ruled with cruelty. Some ruled with charm, and sometimes charm was the sharper weapon. Still, the balance always tilted toward obedience because discipline was the only glue holding a ship together in storms, in sickness, and in fear. The phrase, "a well-disciplined crew," sounded noble in reports, but on deck, it meant something different. It meant broken wills disguised as efficiency. You start to wonder, what's the difference between loyalty and exhaustion, between obedience and surrender? The line blurs like the horizon at dusk. Even nature joined the lesson. A careless sailor up the rigging could fall and vanish before anyone blinked. That possibility alone kept men cautious, their obedience stitched together by instinct and gravity. You might not fear the captain, but you'd certainly fear the sea. The ocean was the ultimate disciplinarian. No paperwork, no speeches, just swift, cold consequence. One evening, as the sky fades pink and the lanterns flicker to life, you spot a boy not older than 16, perched high on the yardarm, punished for dropping a line of rope. His silhouette wavers against the fading sun. He's singing softly to himself, some old folk tune about home, the kind that hurts more than it comforts. The crew glances up, half in pity, half in respect. Even the bosun pretends not to hear. The sea is calm, but his song trembles in the air, a reminder that discipline doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hums. When he's finally called down, his legs wobble, but his grin is stubborn. You realize that's the secret to surviving at sea laugh, when you can sing when you shouldn't, and rest whenever the ocean blinks. Because, in a world ruled by exhaustion, defiance sometimes looks like closing your eyes for just one forbidden minute. It starts as a whisper below deck. Someone mutters, "We've had enough." And suddenly, the air feels heavier than the ocean itself. You can hear it in the way men pass their rum slower, the way laughter dies mid-sentence. Every mutiny begins like a cough. No one wants to acknowledge until it's too late. You've seen the lash and the irons. Now you see what happens when fear stops working. The word mutiny wasn't thrown around lightly. It was the shipboard equivalent of shouting fire in a theater. Even a rumor could sink your career, your ship, or your neck. Captains feared it, like sailors feared storms, unpredictable, contagious, and capable of tearing everything apart in minutes. Sometimes it started small. Maybe the rations went bad again, or pay hadn't come for months. Maybe the captain punished one man too harshly, or the crew finally realized that orders weren't divine. They were just shouted louder than reason. The Royal Navy was notorious for pushing men past breaking point, then acting shocked when they snapped. You remember the HMS Bounty, the crew so fed up with Captain Bligh's tyranny that they tossed him into a longboat and set him adrift. He survived miraculously, which says more about his navigation than his popularity. A mutiny was chaos with choreography. The first step, take the officers by surprise. The second, control the weapons. The third, pray the rest of the crew agrees with you before someone changes sides. The ocean turned every rebellion into theater, loud, frantic, and usually short-lived. Because if you won, you were a hero for a day. If you lost, you were fertilizer for fish. And when a mutiny failed, the punishment wasn't just harsh, it was biblical. The courts-martial were fast, the sentences faster. Men were hanged from the yardarms, their bodies left swinging as floating warnings. The rope became the captain's punctuation mark at the end of rebellion's sentence. Sometimes, as at the Great Spithead and Nore mutinies of 1797, hundreds of men joined together demanding fair pay and better food. For a brief, wild moment, the sailors looked like they might change history. But the Navy's answer was swift. Dozens hanged, hundreds flogged, and the Articles of War rewritten with even sharper edges. You can picture it, the calm, gray morning drums, beating slow as each condemned man steps forward, a noose waiting above. The captain reads the charges in a steady voice. Sedition, disobedience, treason. The crowd stands still, hats off, eyes averted. It's the same ritual as flogging, only quieter final. The sea breeze lifts the sound of rope creaking against wood. It's oddly peaceful, almost respectful, as if even the ocean holds its breath. Mutiny terrified everyone because it flipped the natural order. The idea that ordinary sailors could overthrow their officers struck at the heart of empire itself. If discipline collapsed at sea, where else could it survive? Ships weren't just vessels. They were floating symbols of civilization's control over chaos. And mutiny was proof that chaos could still win. Still, not every rebellion was madness. Some were desperation disguised as courage. Sailors knew the risks. They just reached a point where death by rope seemed kinder than life by whip. And history, with its dry language, calls these events disturbances, as if men were simply misbehaving children. It's astonishing how tidy cruelty looks, once edited into official records. You start to realize how fragile command really is. The captain's power depends entirely on belief on the crew's shared illusion that his authority is sacred. The moment that belief cracks, he's just another man shouting over the wind. You've seen captains who ruled with fear, and others who ruled with fairness. But both kinds knew one truth: loyalty isn't owned, it's borrowed. There's a bitter irony here. The very discipline that kept ships alive also planted the seeds of mutiny. Every lash, every ration cut, every sleepless night built pressure in the hull until the whole system creaked. And when it finally gave way, history called it treason. You might call it cause and effect. As dusk falls, the sea is calm again. The ropes sway softly. No bodies hanging today, only shadows. The captain stands by the rail, pretending the silence means loyalty restored. But you can tell he's listening too closely to the quiet, because silence on a ship is never peace. It's the sound right before the next storm. You step from the man-of-war world of quarterdecks and articles of war into something that looks at first glance friendlier. Pirate decks don't bristle with uniforms. They bristle with opinions. Instead of the captain's glare, carrying the day you hear ballots rattling in a pewter bowl, see hands raised, feel the room temperature change when the quartermaster clears his throat. It's democracy, sure, but the saltwater version, whereby popular vote lives next door to by the pistol. The big surprise is how organized it all is. Pirate crews write their own articles, yes, more articles, but these ones you actually vote on, laying out rules for shares, discipline, lights out, even who gets the musician's instruments if he drowns. The captain is elected, and so is his counterweight, the quartermaster, a kind of floating ombudsman with keys to the store, a ledger for plunder, and the crew's trust, like a dagger tucked in his belt. The quartermaster can overrule the captain in matters of ration and routine. The captain takes back the reins only when a fight's brewing or a sale's worth chasing. It's a constitutional monarchy, where the Constitution fits in a coat pocket and the monarch knows better than to act like one between battles. Pay 2 gets a rethink. Instead of Navy wages that might show up by the next reign, you get shares. Captains might take 2 or 3. Quartermasters 1.5. Gunners, bosuns, and carpenters slightly more. Ordinary hands 1 share. The ship's boy half. Injury compensation appears like rough and ready insurance. Lose an arm, so many pieces of 8. Lose an eye, a smaller purse, but still a purse. Suddenly discipline is tied to dividends. You behave because fairness pays, and because the crew you'll face at the vote next week remembers who hogged the rum and who hauled the anchor. But don't let the voting fool you. You haven't escaped the gallows. You've just traded it for sand. Among pirates, the ultimate punishment isn't always the rope. It's isolation, with a drum roll marooning. You break the code, steal from your mates, cheat at dice knife a friend in the dark, and the crew may not waste a perfectly good noose. They'll row you to a scrap of shore, leave you with a bottle of water, a musket with 1 shot, and maybe a hat for shade if they're feeling philosophical. Then the oars flash, the ship turns her back, and the horizon grows taller than courage. The sea does the paperwork. You can almost hear the vote that sends a man to the beach. It isn't rage, it's accounting. The quartermaster reads the charge. The crew murmurs. The captain watches to see which way the wind of opinion blows, and hands go up. A simple majority can push a human being out of history. That, oddly, is the most sobering part of pirate democracy. Authority comes from below, so when it falls like a trapdoor. Real names cruise through the spray. Charles Vane, fearsome captain of swaggering legend, is deposed by his own men when he refuses a chase they believe would pay. They vote him out and elect Calico Jack Rackham, a man better at flags than strategy, but more agreeable to the mood of the hour. Vane gets a small boat, and bad luck for company. Edward England, who shows mercy to a wrecked enemy captain, offends the crew's hunger. They make him walk the plank of public opinion, marooning him on Mauritius. Democracy, it giveth, it taketh away. It leaves you talking to gulls. Even the codes themselves double as discipline. Bartholomew Roberts. Black Bart is said to ban gambling, insist on lights out, and deny any mistreatment of women aboard. Break the rules, and your share shrinks or vanishes. Your privileges evaporate, and your hammock suddenly migrates to the draftiest part of the ship. Here, punishment isn't always spectacle. It's paperwork with teeth. A man who loses his vote, his share, or his right to rum is a ghost among the living. And yet the same system that can strand a man for cheating will also protect him from a captain's temper. A furious skipper might demand a flogging. The quartermaster shakes his head and points to the article's no such penalty without a vote. Pirates famously hated the Navy's Cat 09. Many outlaw crews forbid it outright or limit it to minor starting. The logic is half moral, half practical. A whipped man is a slow man, and pirate business relies on speed. Why break the back that might haul your loot tomorrow? Still no cat doesn't mean no pain. Smaller penalties stack like wet canvas. Extra watch galley duty, bow chaser. Cleaning water ration, halved a pistol, issued with no powder when boarding. Plenty of ways to turn bravado into humility. And that musket with one shot handed to the marooned man. It's not just for hunting. It's also for choosing not to starve grim arithmetic. Pirate Democrats quietly understood and didn't articulate. You sense how reputation replaces chains. In the Navy, the logbook binds you. In pirate crews, stories do. Steal once, and every mess table whispers. Slacken a chase, and the next vote remembers. You start acting right because your next meal depends on the same hands that will later decide whether you still deserve a hammock. Think of it as the original performance review. 360 degrees, no HR consequences. Immediate feedback salty. There's a modern echo here you can't ignore. Cooperative startups brag about flat structures and shared equity. Pirate ships practically invented the pitch deck. We're anti-bureaucracy. High upside, high risk. Clear incentives, quick exits. The difference is that quick exit sometimes includes an island, a canteen, and a sunset you'll see far too often. Before you nod along to every romantic speech about crew autonomy, ask yourself who writes the code, who holds the keys, and what counts as grounds for exile. The daily texture of this democracy is surprisingly domestic. Issues are raised at commons. A muster where grievances spill. Like bilge water, the cook's meat is short. The carpenter wants new nails. The powder monkey swears the gunner skimmed his ration. The quartermaster mediates, the captain weighs in, and the crew votes. No Latin, no wigs, just practical justice. conducted with bare feet and a lot of pointing. And because everyone's armed and the deck is small, civility becomes self-preservation. Of course, the system cracks when greed gets louder than principle. A captain can stoke fear, a quartermaster can massage the tally, and a loud Monriety can turn a fair deck into a kangaroo court. That's when marooning shifts from justice to expedience. Unpopular men vanish not for crimes, but for inconveniences. Democracy has a blind spot for charisma. Pirates discovered that long before campaign posters. You think back to lashes and irons and realize why outlaw crews found votes so intoxicating. The dignity of being asked is a whip few leaders bother to try. A man who raises his hand to choose a course will raise it again to haul the sheet. Self-discipline replaces imposed discipline, not because pirates are noble, but because profit trains character as efficiently as fear. The articles say you'll get your share. The horizon says you'd better earn it. And if you fail, the articles really fail them. Sand waits. Picture the ritual: a low surf, a sky too blue to believe the ship pulled up just beyond musket range. Your mates row you in silence. No speeches, no cat. The quartermaster hands you bread and water and doesn't look away. He's not cruel. He's consistent. The boat noses back through the foam, and the world reduces to wind light and the sudden volume of your own breathing. Punishment at sea often echoes. Marooning hums. It's a quiet you can feel in your teeth. When the sails finally shrink to white scratches on the horizon, you understand the pirate genius for discipline. They didn't need prisons. They had distance. They didn't need ropes. They had reputation. And when those failed, they had sand sun and the steady metronome of the tide. You're left with a question that belongs both to wooden decks and open-plan offices, which keeps order better fear from above or judgment from beside. Either way, on saltwater or carpet, the vote always comes with a shadow. You've watched officers brandish rules and pirates brandish votes. But the strictest bosun on earth is the ocean itself. The sea doesn't lecture, it demonstrates. Miss a knot, and the sail tears. Forget a lantern, and the watch loses a man. Skip the mop, and the deck becomes a skating rink with splinters. Pretty soon, you learn the oldest command of all. Do the small things right, or the big thing, staying alive, does itself wrong. Morning discipline starts with water soap and stone. You kneel with a holy stone, a literal block of sandstone, and scrub the deck until it glows like a church pew. It isn't about sparkle. It's about safety. Salt crystals grind under your palms. Gray water snakes to the scuppers, and your shoulders burn with the sermon of repetition. Clean deck, fewer slips. Dry deck, fewer fevers. You'd think housework couldn't save a ship, but it does the same way a tidy kitchen keeps a restaurant from poisoning itself. If you've ever rolled your eyes at a checklist, try sailing without one. Next comes the rigging. Every line checked, every splice smoothed, every block oiled until it squeaks less than your knees. A dull knife punishes you faster than any captain, so you keep yours sharp enough to whisper through rope. The bosun's whistle still rules the tempo. Sure, but the real conductor is the wind. You reef when it frowns, you ease when it smiles, and you never second-guess the sky twice. A ship is a choir that sings only when each throat knows its note. Miss yours, and the chorus becomes weather. Storm drill is another teacher, the kind that grades on a curve, called survival. Hands to reef, and you're up the shroud's toes-biting tarred rope body curling around a spar as if it were a familiar friend with bad breath. You feel the canvas heave like a living thing while you tie reef points with the stubborn tenderness you'd use on a frightened horse. If the gale bullies harder, the master may heave to angle the sails and rudder so the ship clutches the wind instead of racing it. Less romantic than running before the storm, but much kinder to masts and souls. Some captains lie a hull everything down, and lashed, praying the hull rides it out like a barrel. Others set a storm, try-sail a handkerchief of canvas that keeps the bow honest. There's theory, there's bravado, and then there's the moment a wall of water votes against both. Food discipline is its own universe. You divide biscuit beef and peas into rations, not by appetite, but by math. The purser's scale is more feared than the cat, because hunger nags longer than stripes sting. Water is worse, it goes stale. Turns green, grows a garden, no one wants to eat, so you guard every drop like a coin with your mother's face on it. Rum arrives as consolation and caution. Neat rum breeds trouble. Watered rum breeds cooperation and no. Rum breeds poetry the captain does not appreciate. And then there's the ghost with a sailor's name scurvy. You hear old hands call it the great softening. The way gums soften and wills soften and bodies fold like damp canvas. The signs are quiet, at first fatigue, that laughs at sleep. A bruise that can't explain itself, breath that tastes like iron filings. Later recovery becomes a negotiation with oranges you don't have. In 1747, James Lind runs his famous trial on HMS Salisbury, handing different remedies to different sailors, like a chef testing sauces. The men who get citrus perk up, like plants after rain. Years later, the lesson finally travels faster than the ship's citrus's works, even if no one can spell vitamin. Captain Cook doesn't carry a pharmacy, but he enforces hygiene like a religion, and experiments with sauerkraut wort, and whatever green thing will consent to live in a barrel. His crews come home startlingly intact. That's self-discipline with a menu. Medicine is mostly buckets air and stubbornness. The surgeon's chest rattles with saws that everyone pretends not to notice, but his better tools are fresh air-dry hammocks, laundered shirts, and the unpopular command to open the scuttles and let the stink out. Ventilation may not sing ballads, yet it rescues more men than heroics do. Even the bilge aromatic enough to outlaw poetry gets pumped, because stagnant water breeds fevers faster than a tavern rumor. You pump, therefore you live. Navigation adds a different kind of restraint, number discipline. Noon sun, sextant up horizon, trembling. You catch the star, like a pickpocket catches a purse, and reduce it to degrees that will either love you or bury you. At night, you heave the log, literal wood, with a line of knots. Let it drag astern. Count the seconds on an hourglass, and call your ship's speed with a voice that must not lie. Dead reckoning is exactly what it says on the tin. You reckon correctly, or the adjective becomes a prophecy. The sea forgives almost any sin except self-deception. You notice how the best captains punish carelessness faster than backtalk. A sharp retort doesn't rip a sail. A lazy splice might. Nelson is famous for courage, yes, but the quieter truth is his crews were drilled until muscle memory looked like gallantry. Cook's charts matter not because the pen was grand, but because he wouldn't tolerate sloppy soundings. Bly, for all his temper, could navigate a crowded dream through an empty ocean. His longboat voyage after the Bounty Mutiny is a masterclass in rationing and resolve. You don't have to like these men to learn from their stubborn precision. Self-discipline also wears shoes called routine. Bells mark time in 2-hour chunks. 8 bells, and you swap lives with the next watch. You eat when told, sleep when allowed, and discover that willpower is finite, but ritual can carry you farther than pride. Tie your knife to your belt the same way every morning, and you won't lose it when the ship jumps like a spooked horse. Coil down your line the same direction every time, and it will pay out without sulking when the world decides to tilt. Little habits become life jackets you don't have to inflate. Sometimes the discipline is social. You tidy your mess table because the man who eats there after you will be your hands on the yardarm at midnight. You share your last dry scrap of tobacco with the old topman because, tomorrow, he might share the last dry joke when the rain refuses to stop. Morale is a rope that looks decorative until you need to climb it. An interactive thought for you. On your worst day ashore, who's your top man? The person whose small habit keeps you from slipping. Sailors knew their answers. It's why songs survived storms. And the sea's final lesson. Humility is quicker than heroism. One careless moment. One unsecured pin. One lantern left where canvas can greet it, and your floating town becomes a rumor. That's why even swaggering pirates practiced fire drills. That's why even tyrannical captains insisted on clean galley chimneys. You bow to physics, or you bow to consequences. The rope has no politics. When the watch changes and the sky bruises toward evening, you taste salt on the wind that wasn't there at noon. Instantly, the crew moves, not because anyone shouts, but because the weather has already spoken. Sails reef a point, hatches, dog lines checked like heartbeats. It looks like obedience. It feels like common sense. After months at sea, you realize the hierarchy was never man above man. It was always ship above everyone. And above the ship, the weather gliding on with that polite smile it wears right before it tests your homework. The harbor cheers, but your back still flinches. The land smells like bread and rain, yet every creak of a cartwheel sounds suspiciously like a bosun's whistle. The ship warps to the quay with that smug little sigh wood makes when it stops pretending to be a mountain. Ropes thump gulls audition for leadership, and a clerk in a hat too clean for reality sets up a pay table like a magician's stage. You've dreamed of this moment through lash counts and masthead naps. Wages shore leave a chair that doesn't swing. Then the ledger opens, and you remember the ship may have anchored, but the rules still walk beside you. The purser clears his throat. Deductions first. Slops the clothing you were encouraged to buy. Tobacco, lost tools, extra candles, surgeon's poultices. You didn't ask for fines for idle hands. You don't recall being idle, and the sacred victuals short entry that somehow never shortens the bill. Your coins arrive, clipped by numbers like a cake you watch, be sliced until all that's left is crumbs and congratulations. Interactive question for the shore. Have you ever opened a paycheck that felt lighter than your week? Then you've already been to sea. Prize money is the glittering rumor that kept many crews from muttering too loudly. Capture an enemy ship by chase by bluff, by sheer luck, and a prize court ashore will value the hull and cargo, then pay out in slices from captain to cabin boy. In theory, anyway. In practice cases, crawl through legal molasses. By the time the purse arrives, some of the names on the list have become initials on a memorial. Officers always remember the arithmetic. Hands often remember the waiting. Still, an honest prize could transform a life. There are tavern stories of ordinary seamen who bought a cobbler's shop or a garden with pear trees from a single windfall. Most sailors settled for buying their mothers a roof that didn't leak. Pirate Democrats faced their own version of payday, the quartermaster divvying shares in a ritual that was part audit, part festival. Tools counted powder, weighed trinkets laid out like shy coins on a rough plank. Grievances aired one last time, because nothing haunts a small ship like an unfair split. Calm voices, if you're lucky. Pistols speaking, if you're not. Then men drift to shore, with full pouches and fuller plans, discovering that gold burns holes in pockets faster on land than worm does in hull. The articles promise equality. The tavern promises music. The sunrise promises regret. Discipline also steps off the gangplank with you in subtler ways. Your body carries the syllabus. Lash tracks live under tattoos, anchors to disguise tally marks, swallows to distract from old stripes. A mermaid's curl sketched exactly where the rope once sang. Scars become cartography you show only to barbers and doctors. Knees remember deck drills when stairs feel too still. And sleep is the strangest harbor. In a quiet room, your eyes snap open at imaginary bells. A door hinge squeals and some old reflex inventories. Canvas weather watch. Land silence is a noise you haven't learned to trust. Some men try shore jobs and discover land doesn't forgive mistakes either. It just uses different tools. A carpenter finds that a bench doesn't lash you, it simply ignores you. A former topman becomes a rigger and swears the city yawns like a lazy wind. Others seek the familiar discipline in new uniforms, customs boats, pilot gigs, even the watchman's rattle clicking down a lamplit street like a tame version of the bosun's call. The hierarchy shrinks but never vanishes. The habit of looking up at weather becomes the habit of looking over a ledger. And you still coil ropes the same way because good habits dislike being unemployed. There are institutions waiting too. Greenwich Hospital takes in broken sailors, in pensioners, with red coats and stories that skip the hardest sentences. Outpensioners collect a few coins and a lot of aches. Admiralty courts adjudicate quarrels you thought the ocean had swallowed. The victualling yards still smell like brine and hope. Even the churchyard has a flavor of the sea. Stones carved with anchors and hourglasses epitaphs that read like log entries concludes a voyage. Here lies Thomas Reed, called by a fair wind. You hear about reforms, citrus now, routine hygiene, more than a sermon flogging debated in Parliament by men whose hands never tarred a line. Speeches sound brave at a safe distance. On deck, nothing had changed until bosses of rope and salt said so. Captain Cook's obsession with cleanliness becomes a model, Nelson's charisma, a standard, Bligh's navigation. A parable, Lynn's citrus trial, a footnote that grows into policy. Progress at sea moves like a laden barge, slow, steady, unstoppable, only after you commit to the tow. And yet the old economy of fear doesn't retire gracefully. Press gangs still haunt waterfront alleys in some eras, turning a quick drink into an involuntary contract. Tavern keepers run tabs as sticky as tar, and debts press men back toward the only work that pays in coin and risk. Parents whisper to romantic sons that the sea is character building. Retired topmen smile not unkindly and change the subject. Humor survives like an outpensioner with stubborn lungs. The sea cured me of laziness, one old hand says, and kindly replaced it with rheumatism. Ashore, authority dresses better. A magistrate's wig replaces a captain's hat. A landlord's ledger replaces the logbook. A factory bell replaces 8 bells. You notice how your spine straightens at shouted orders, even when they come from a sergeant drilling boys who think buttons equal bravery. Discipline, once external, has moved in. You check lines that aren't their secure doors, already latched ration your week, as if provisions might spoil. It isn't fear. It's muscle memory for consequences. Some men never fully moor. They volunteer for the lifeboat crew because storms are easier with oars in hand. They teach boys to reef canvas on training brigs where the articles get rewritten in friendlier ink. They stand on piers during gales, squinting like old captains reading weather on strangers' faces. When a whistle blows, any whistle, they still look up. The money, when it comes, becomes new tools, boots, a coat that resists rain, a better knife, a book with a ribbon you swear you'll read. Sometimes a ring because someone waited. Sometimes a little house that doesn't move, and a bench by the door where you can watch the wind muss other people's hair. You tell yourself the ship is finished with you. Then a squall darkens the estuary, and your hands move unconsciously. Folding the newspaper like a sail you can reef from a chair. What of justice? A few captains face inquiries. A handful lose commissions. Far more are toasted by men who admired their victories and skipped the footnotes. The sea rarely leaves evidence tidy enough for courtrooms. But stories leak, surgeons talk, clerks gossip, widows ask pointed questions at inquests. A culture inches forward, not by outrage alone, but by petty improvements that add up: better food, cleaner water, wiser charts, fairer pay systems that deduct less and explain more. You might not live to see all of it, yet you recognize the direction. Even tides need a nudge from the moon. In quieter moments, you visit the waterfront museum that smells of wax and rope. There's a glass case with a cat o' nine, a set of bilboes, a holy stone worn to a friendly oval by hands you almost remember. A note says keel hauling rare feared, and another says Lynn's Trial 1747. You feel absurdly seen by a placard. Then a school group trundles past in bright coats, and a small voice asks, "Did it hurt?" The guide chooses honesty over theater. Discipline kept them alive, and it also hurt. You nod at the compromise. Evening drops like a sail, well flaked. Somewhere down the quay, a band fumbles a hornpipe. A baker slaps dough. A bell rings for a ship leaving on the tide. You check your pockets out of reflex and feel both lighter and richer than you expected. Not all scars are debts. Some are receipts for lessons learned in a currency the land struggles to count. You turn toward home, whatever home has come to mean, and the street smells of rain and coal. and something sweet. The discipline that once felt like an iron collar now feels in places like a sturdy spine. You don't bless the lash. You don't excuse the irons. You don't pretend the rumors were only rumors. You simply admit that order saved you on nights when heroism would have drowned. The ship has let you go, but it hasn't left you. And when the wind lifts a corner of your coat, you smile, because you've learned the oldest rule of both sea and shore. Tie the small knots, mind the quiet checks, pay attention when the weather changes, and you'll likely see another dawn. Tonight, you trace the ship's hard lessons, bells, ropes, lash, and ledger storms, and small routines that kept fragile wood and stubborn hearts afloat. Let those clangs fade to a soft hush. Breathe like a steady tide. Keep only the rule that kindness and carefulness save lives. Harbor lights flicker, the deck grows still, and your thoughts drift gently home now.